My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope. Beef Pork Ribs, once again, we are here in the internet to meet and record. I've lost count. I think this is now 5 or 6 weeks where we've been encouraged to physically distance ourselves from other people, and people seem to be calling it the quarantine now, as I'm not forced to be in quarantine, but it certainly feels that way because I really I was gonna say outside of grocery shopping, I haven't left my my dwelling place, but my roommate Professor F has been doing most of the grocery shopping lately. So really, I have not left my dwelling place very much. But nonetheless, BPR, how are you doing this week?
I'm still doing quite well. Have not gone out for groceries. Oh no, I have gone out for groceries this week actually, extraordinarily. Because also in my living arrangement, I'm not usually the one who goes out for them. It was a good time though. We quite enjoyed getting out in the fresh air in a way that's not just going out on the balcony, so that's been nice.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to our episode last week on Dungeons & Dragons, basically as soon as we were done recording the episode, everyone who was involved with the episode messaged each other in a group chat on Facebook saying we should play D&D together, and admittedly, that was enough to convince me to take the plunge and commit to playing a Dungeons & Dragons game. So we had our first session, I think that's what you call it, yesterday. And yeah. BPR is our dungeon master. So BPR, do you feel satisfied knowing that I am now playing Dungeons & Dragons?
I mean, I don't know if satisfied is the right word, but I am very happy that I'm happy you seem to enjoy it mostly, actually. And I think that's ultimately a Dungeons Master's greatest accomplishment is if other people enjoy it.
So for those who listened to last week's episode on D&D, Dungeons & Dragons, I have indeed started playing a campaign online with Beef Pork Ribs, with One Shot, Pixel Patch is in there, and then both my brothers are in there as well. So it's quite the interesting situation, and we'll keep you posted week to week to see how it progresses. But one thing that came out of having all those people on the podcast last week, we've sort of put an open invitation to everyone who's ever been a guest on the Bat Jar Podcast to be a part of the show in this season where we're quarantined and we can't get together, and we're recording online anyway. So one of our former co-hosts and frequent guest of the podcast is here this week. So let's give a Bat Jar welcome to Ben the Movie Buff.
Hey, how are ya? Thank you, whatever that was. It's great to be back, guys. I didn't think that I'd be coming back to the show in this capacity, in this way, but I had no idea that our lives were going to be turned upside down in the last few months. But it's great to be back, guys, and I'm looking forward to hanging out and chatting with you guys today.
So, Ben the Movie Buff, you have been more active on your podcast. You've been more active on your YouTube channel lately, and I find it funny because we literally dedicated 12 episodes to our Memory Lane series where we reflected on the past decade, and you actually just put out a YouTube video going over your top movies of the last decade. So you, in your own way, did your own little memory lane series.
Yes.
What inspired you to were you copying us, or perhaps you had other inspiration?
Well, there were a few influences. I think the big one was once in a while I get recommendations. Like people ask me, "Can you do an episode about this? Do an episode about that?" And I can't remember who it was, but someone, possibly on Facebook, in the last few months, when I was posting my best movies of 2019 list, asked me if I could do a best of the 2010s. And I thought that would be a really cool thing to do. But of course, in January and February, I was quite busy with work. So I obviously didn't have much time for it. And then everything changed. And I had like a wedding that I was editing for like the first few weeks of quarantine, of lockdown. And then once I started kind of finishing work up on that, I thought to myself, geez, like I have all this free time on my hands. I should do more Ben the Movie Buff. So my plan is to try and get an episode out every week. So I have one that I'm working on right now to have ready for Thursday. But I think a lot of it was just this idea that yeah, I'd seen 18 really amazing movies in the last 10 years. Movies that I've given my grade of a 9 out of 10 on IMDb. So all my 9 movies, I was like, all right, I have to try and rank them and see where they fall on this list. But yeah, it was something that I've been wanting to do for some time now, and I finally had the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I watched that video, and there is some crossover between what you considered the best of the decade and what we've considered the best of the decade. So, in some respects, we're on the same page. But of course, you're on your own wavelength over there. So certainly, everyone has the time. Go check out Ben the Movie Buff's channel. We'll put a link to it in the description for the episode. Uh, we asked all the guys who were here last week what is something nerdy or geeky they've been up to since they're last on the show, and I'm going to tailor that a bit to this situation. What is something nerdy or geeky that you have been doing during the quarantine?
What's funny is that I've watched a lot of movies in the last 4 or 5 months, and I was planning on taking a break because I was going to be working throughout most of March. But then once everything changed quickly, I basically thought to myself, well, you know what? We don't have many new movies coming out because of the situation that we're currently in. So I thought to myself, I guess it's time to continue watching as many movies as possible. So I have 2 lists that I'm going through initially to try and complete these lists. The first one is a list of the American Film Institute's 100 greatest films of all time. I have now seen 98, and I have 2 more movies to go. So when I see In the Heat of the Night and Sophie's Choice over the next week, I will have seen every single movie on that list. And then the next list I'm trying to get through is every single Disney animated theatrical feature, right? So there are 58 in total, and I'm 5 away from completing that list. So I have to watch some older, kind of more experimental Disney movies from the 40s. And once I've seen all of those, I've seen every single Disney animated movie that was released in theaters.
Does Song of the South count?
It does not because it's mostly live action, even though there are some animated um, portions to that movie. The list that I'm checking out does not have a Song of the South.
Well, very good. So I think it might be funny just to kind of talk about something that happened to us this week. So I was leading a online training course for people that work for the same ministry as myself. And one of these trainings, there were about 40 people participating in it. And so I made the decision to, because I was the one hosting the call, I kind of decided to set it up so that they had to go in a waiting room before entering. So I had to approve who was coming into the call. And then I had it set so that they were muted upon entry. And I had it set so that the only way they could not unmute themselves. Actually, the only way they could speak like audibly is if I like clicked unmute for them. And so it forced them to use the hand raising feature in Zoom, wherein you basically put your hand up, and it forced them to use the chat more. And also just maybe those listening understand, but the reality of doing a lot of video calls is that you hear a lot of background noise that is very disruptive to the experience. So I wasn't trying to like be overly controlling. I was just trying to present a good audio experience for everyone. So if anyone who was a part of those trains is listening to this, hopefully it didn't seem like I was too controlling over the whole thing. But certainly muting the microphones was a good idea.
And I guess for myself, I think honestly the most exciting thing I did was doing the prep for that D&D campaign. I it was one I had toyed with before, and it seemed like a good starting point. Because it was mostly, I don't know. I thought it was a fun one because it had a lot of options, but all of them started in one place. I like campaigns that are more self-contained, but also that have different options, not completely railroaded. So it also meant that I had basically six diverging storylines that I had to prepare in case the players took one of them. So yeah, that was interesting as well.
Cool.
BP or not BPR. Ben the movie buff. Outside of making it through those lists of movies, was there anything interesting that happened this week?
Um, Other than that, not that much. It's a lot of the usual stuff, right? We dedicate one day to go out and do groceries, and obviously that's kind of an experience in itself. We spent a lot of time playing with our son, who is crawling around like crazy. So it makes our days a little busier because he just wants to go everywhere. But yeah, as for nerdy stuff, it's basically just ripping through as many movies as I can, and also working on some of my own content too. So I feel like I'm doing fairly well.
So we are here today to talk about the new Pixar film Onward.
Yeah.
Now, this film was released in theaters in March of 2020, and it was probably one of the last films to get a wide theatrical release before the pandemic for COVID-19 kind of led to everyone again quarantining themselves, physical distancing, and all that. And it was really, I think it was only maybe 2 weeks into this film's release before movie theaters were ordered to close.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a unique movie in the sense it's one of the last ones that got a wide release before the pandemic took off. So this could be the most recent new movie we talk about for a while, unless we maybe talk about some streaming films that have come out or whatever. But all that to say, Onward, Beef Pork Ribs, when we talked about movies that were coming out in 2020, you had not heard at all about this film. And my attempt at describing it to you on that episode was really your first experience of the movie. Did that conversation lead you to like looking up the trailer, or were you just kind of blasé about it?
I think I saw the trailer at some point. I don't know if it was because of that conversation or not. Um, I think what ultimately convinced me was knowing who the two main characters were voiced by, because that just sounded like a good time in and of itself. Having Chris Pratt talking to, yep, that other guy whose name I can't remember right now.
Tom Holland.
Tom Holland, that's it. Yeah,
Yeah.
was that was like, oh yeah, I could see this, and I didn't really be. I don't think I was that influenced about the whole like fantasy aspect of it. I don't know. I found that wasn't necessarily a big selling point for me so much as like it would something that was looking fun afterwards.
How about you, Ben, the movie buff? I'm guessing you were probably more aware of this movie coming out.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, I think I saw a trailer or at least heard about the movie sometime last year. And as I am with many Pixar movies, I have a general excitement about them just because, I mean, I got to see the first one, Toy Story, back in the fall of 1995, right? And since then, I've seen every single Pixar movie that's been released to date. So I wasn't, losing my mind over Onward, but I was fairly excited for it.
Yeah, I can remember it being announced at D23, the Disney Comic Con they do every couple of years, and kind of similarly to BPR, what got me excited was the fact it was Tom Holland and Chris Pratt. I'm like, this is awesome. They're gonna put
Yeah.
Spider Man and Star Lord in the same movie
Hmm.
as brothers. So I was immediately intrigued for that alone. Like I had no at that point there wasn't really information about the plot of the film. It was just called Onward, and that was kind of all I had to go off of. So as more and more information came out about the film, the directors were describing it as a suburban fantasy world, which to me kind of sounded interesting, but it also didn't sound too original. I've seen, when we talked about the movies coming out this year, I compared it to Shrek because I said like Shrek kind of felt like it had that sensibility where it's this fantasy world where there's magic, but then they have kind of Starbucks stand-ins and like they for humor's sake they inject elements of like modern culture into the world.
Mm.
So even by the time the trailer had come out for Onward, I'm like, yeah, this it's kind of clever, but to me it felt a lot like Shrek.
I will say though that there is the important difference that this movie incorporated the reasons for which that was happening into the lore of the movie, which I'm sure we'll end up talking about. But like, it wasn't exact. Like Shrek was a fantasy movie that happened to have references to pop culture, whereas this was really a fantasy movie where pulp culture exists, if that makes sense. Like where there's a reason for these things to actually exist and have evolved into it. Whereas Shrek, it's just there.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I'd agree.
I put on here. It reminded me of the Netflix film Bright,
Yep.
which, and I say that I have not actually watched Bright yet, but I've heard people talk about it on podcasts. And the way they explain it is that it's a fantasy world where there used to be all this magic and these fantasy creatures, and then the movie is set in modern day, where it's seemingly it's like all these fantasy creatures are just sort of part of the modern world. And it sounds like both you guys are more familiar with Bright than I am. So is that a fair comparison?
If you stick to the superficial, basic concept of it and not the execution, kind of. But
Yeah.
even
Oh, sorry.
yeah,
Continue.
well, I was just gonna say, even there, even beyond the execution, I feel that Bright didn't fully justify it as much either. Like it was something that was present, but it wasn't kind of part of the uh, like in this movie. It was very much part of the core of the story was why the magic is or isn't there, and it was very big part of the characters and their development too. Like not all of them, but most of them. So I think, well, I think generally one of the biggest critique of Bright was that the world building wasn't done very well, and I think that's where there is the biggest difference. Is like the basic concept would be the same, but this movie it was done for meaningful reasons, not just because it would be cool.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. I think, and there are a few other Pixar movies that kind of people have noted are kind of reminiscent of other films in general. But you know, um, like like beef pork ribs was saying that yeah, there's definitely similarity in the concept and the basic idea of you know this world feeling like ours but having fantasy elements in it. But then yeah, when it comes to the execution, like where the story is headed, and I mean, for me, Bright was like it was okay. It wasn't that memorable, but it definitely it's not like there were many plot points in Bright that reminded me of Onward. Onward definitely feels like it's doing his own thing, even if the setting is somewhat reminiscent of what Bright did a few years ago.
So this movie was directed by a man named Dan Scanlon. Hope I'm saying that right. And he has been quoted as saying that the film was inspired by the death of his father. And then apparently he got the idea after hearing an audio recording of his father's voice. And as we're going to get into, it makes a lot of sense how the death of a father and the relationship with one's brother could lead to this movie because that's pretty much the plot of the movie. So um, when this movie was being released critically, the Rotten Tomatoes people were generally favorable to the film. The audiences gave it a 95%, which is fairly high. And the critics gave it an 88%, which again is high, but certainly not as beloved as other Pixar movies. Does that sound about right to you guys?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit more, but I think like by Pixar standards, it wasn't incredible. It was good. Like it's a very good movie, but yeah, I don't think critically it was that good. Although it is definitely coming back to like kind of Pixar's very strong feel good vibes at especially at the end, which I think is why I'm not surprised it did really well with audiences.
Because something that was striking for me is that it got an A minus from Cinema Score, which to me it's like, oh, that seems like a good grade. But they were in the reporting, they made it clear that A minus is like the lowest score any Pixar movie's ever gotten.
Wow, that's interesting.
So people seem to be very favorable, and I'm surprised because not every Pixar movie's good. So the fact that it's kind of like in that sense, it's towards the bottom tier of Pixar movies, like that says something. And then even more striking than that, when it did premiere at the box office, it only grossed $39 million, which, if you think about some of these Pixar movies, like Toy Story 4 last year made over $100 million. Incredibles 2 made almost $170 million. Even like Cars 3, I think it made like $70 million its opening weekend.
Yeah, I think the movies you're mentioning, of course, are all sequels, right? They're all based off of an earlier Pixar movie. But you are right in the sense that we've seen other, like even a movie like Inside Out, for example, if I remember correctly, I think opened around the tune of $91 million. And this is like a movie that is a standalone movie, that it's not based off of any other previously established Pixar franchise. So yeah, $39 million is kind of low to open. But of course, I feel like it was just bad timing too, right? A lot of people were wondering, oh, with something like Onward, are they going to push that back as well? And they didn't. They still kind of went ahead with it to see what would happen. And if the circumstances were different, I could see it potentially making more money. But yeah, you got to wonder, like, would it have made $50 million if everything were normal? Would it have made 60, 70 million? I don't know if it would have gone that high, but yeah, I can see why it made the numbers that it did.
Because it's like it came out like March 6th. Like this was a good 2 weeks before all the measures related to COVID-19 were being introduced. So, do you guys think that there already at that point there was like a fear of like going out in public, or like a concern that, oh, maybe I should wait and not go see this movie? Or do you think it actually just says that fewer people were interested in seeing this one?
I think it might be a little bit of a mixture of both because I do remember like the theaters were getting really desperate around the time of its release to let people know that they were going to stay open and that they were going to keep showing movies. But at the same time, like opening weekend is always, or opening week is always a good indicator, right? Like not absolutely always, but they tend to be one of the indicators they use. And in its opening week, like you said, all the measures weren't quite in. I think it still would have done better given other circumstances, but I'm not sure it would have been that much better. Like again, not to say it was a bad movie or in any way, but yeah, compared to some of the rest of Pixar, I don't think I'd go as far as saying it was the worst movie they made, but I have personal grievances against a couple of Pixar movies. Uh, but it definitely is not, on the level of some of their other things. Neither in, I think, originality nor in how it kind of hits the marks it's supposed to.
Yeah, I agree. And I would also even make the point that I think the reason why some people that were planning on seeing it and decided not to might have something to do with the fact that, if I remember correctly, I think the first article I read about the coronavirus, like, being a big issue in China was sometime in January, right? And I think as time went on, you keep on hearing more and more news about the coronavirus slowly spreading. So I can't help but wonder if during the month and a half that more people kept on hearing about this problem that wasn't on our doorstep yet, but it felt like it was kind of on its way. I think that might have scared people too, because I'm pretty sure the last movie I saw in theaters was Birds of Prey in early March, and I think that was like a few days before Onward opened. And the theater I went to, there were still a lot of people going to the movies, from what I could tell. But I think it's quite possible that, especially during an opening, like a big opening of a Pixar movie, that yeah, maybe some people did get scared and decided that they wanted to stay home.
In other words, there was a fear that, oh, there's gonna be a lot of people there because it's a Pixar movie, so I won't go, and that just basically led to a lot of people not going.
I think so. Yeah, could be it.
Yeah, and the movie theaters were closed within 2 weeks of Onward's release, so Disney made the decision to make it available for purchase on digital pretty much right away. I think it was like maybe a week after that, like towards the end of March, and at the same time, they announced that the film would be available for streaming on Disney Plus the first week of April. And I was genuinely surprised by that news because, like, I know this is an unprecedented time in a lot of respects, but the fact that a film it went straight from being in the theaters to being on streaming within a month was wild to hear. And it's kind of annoying now because, like, when this is all over, it'll be in my head. It is possible for them to give me the movie I saw in theaters a lot quicker, but they're just choosing not to. What did
Yeah.
you guys What did you guys think about that whole decision?
I was surprised by it, but I just like the fact that I got to see it sooner than I would have expected to. So yeah, it was nice to know that we'd have access to it sooner than expected.
I think, yeah, similar things, but also I think it's important to look at it from their point of view as well. Like, because of the isolation, a lot of streaming services are probably getting a lot of business, and having something like that to be released, same thing with like Frozen 2, they released them earlier than they would have, but that brought a lot of people to Disney Plus. So I think there is a little bit of that, trying to keep up with the other. Like, it wasn't as much of a race before, but now it's kind of more important to, or the market is more ripe to secure those things. So I think putting in like a bunch of new things as soon as possible really makes it more exclusive there
Yes, absolutely.
from the business side.
Hmm.
Yeah, it made me really excited because I was doing Exodus 90 when the film came out, so I'm like, okay, like I won't be able to see it for a while. But then finding out it was gonna be on Disney Plus, I'm like, well, this is great. I can actually just watch it from home, and it kind of like I said, I now have this kind of like artificial expectation that every time a new movie comes out, I can watch it on streaming not too long afterwards. So hopefully, I can just get readjusted to the normal way of life when this is all said and done. I know Ben the Movie Buff and I have talked about this, but all the YouTubers and people online who usually break down box office records and numbers for each week are now having to like look at digital movie rentals because that's the only comparable thing that exists right now. And even home video sales, obviously, like people are probably still buying things online, but you can't track the sales of that as closely. So, like a lot of things, Onward is kind of a trendsetter. It's sort of setting the example for other movies to come, and yeah, I get like I said, it was one of the last films to get released before this whole stuff started. So um, we should really just start talking about the movie itself now. So Beef Pork Ribs, give us the Blu-ray case description of the plot for Onward.
Excuse me, I'm looking for 2 teenage elves.
We're going on a quest.
Don't worry, I told them about the map. I told them about the gym. I told them about the curse. I forgot to tell them about the curse. The what?
Oh, boy.
You still got the rope, right?
Yeah, I got it. Onward,
We have to get to the boys fast.
March 5th.
In a world where technology has surpassed magic, even though magic can still do things way better than technology. I mean, in a world where technology has made magic almost obsolete, 2 young brothers, one of whom has never ever met his father, and the other one who's only have 3 or 4 memories of him, find a magic wand that allows them to summon their father for one day. Unfortunately, the spell kind of fails the first time, and they only have his lower half, and they go on a quest to get a phoenix crystal in order to summon the top half. Hijink ensues, they get closer, they have emotional moments, and they save the place from a curse that they provoked by their quest.
All right, so
I think I got everything.
yeah, that sounds about right. So we kind of mentioned that our main pull to watch this film was seeing Tom Holland and Chris Pratt play against each other. And if I'm being totally honest, Tom Holland's performance for me, it wasn't. It's like, yeah, he sounds like his Spider-Man, but there wasn't anything like super impressive about it. Chris Pratt's kind of more boisterous performance stood out to me, but I love Tom Holland, but there was like nothing there that was like, yeah, this is like an excellent performance here.
I think when I was watching it with Mjornil, my fiance, she kind of pointed out that it was funny that they made Chris Pratt the funny fat guy again, which is kind of what he was famous for, before Guardians of the Galaxy where he got fit. But like, it's funny that they just made him that character again. But I kind of have to agree somewhat. I think that, but I think it also has to do with like what the characters were. Chris Pratt's character was one that needed to be more out there, whereas like it's hard to tell whether it was just an understated role, like performance by Tom Holland, because it was kind of more of an understated role, and a much less vibrant character, which kind of can make things a lot harder, especially in voice acting.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because even thinking back, especially to the first 30 minutes of the movie, there's a number of scenes where Tom Holland's character, Ian, I think his name is, he's very nervous about. I think it's his first day at school, and trying to do all these things on this list that he writes down, And it's funny that when you hear him talking, it kind of brings you back to his kind of nervous, boyish vibe that he gives off as Peter Parker in the Spider-Man movies, right? Like when I saw Homecoming, one of my first thoughts was that, man, he kind of reminds me of like a young Michael J. Fox, like a Marty McFly, the way he kind of talks and kind of trips over his words and this and that. And I feel like some of that does kind of make itself known as in this movie. And I think it's that case of when you have an actor that's good at acting a certain way, they do sometimes tend to get a bit typecast because we know they can do it. So it's quite reasonable to be able to get that kind of performance out of them.
Now, I did buy the chemistry between these two. Like, they did feel like brothers, if that makes sense.
Yep, up to a point, but I'll get to that when we talk more in depth about the events.
All I'm saying is that Tom Holland's supposed to be in this Uncharted movie, so he better steer away from this awkward, dorky teenager by the time he gets to that movie.
Yep.
Now, having just been recently exposed to Dungeons and Dragons in a more intentional way, I, of course, am aware that there are influences of Dungeons and Dragons on this film. So, BPR is the person who probably has the most experience with that game on this podcast. Maybe you can speak to how you feel like they use those influences, good or bad.
I'm actually glad that they didn't lean into it as much as they could have, because it kind of made the world its own thing. I think honestly, we say influence of Dungeons and Dragons because that's the most common fantasy RPG role-playing game, but really, there's this kind of awkward thing where you're talking about even something is influenced by Dungeons and Dragons versus other things. Unfortunately, Dungeons and Dragons is very heavily influenced by the Terry Pratchett books as well as Lord of the Rings, like almost exclusively those books for like the way magic works and the way that the world is formed. So I think it's more fair to say like a fantasy, and I find that what was kind of RPG influenced in it was a big part of the characters and how kind of their perception of the world, which was for I forgot Chris Pratt's characters, but his entire world view was more or less biased by a role playing game, which in that context was historically accurate, and which I thought was hilarious. But also true, like there are historical based role playing games that exist, and it makes total sense. And in a world where magic did used to exist, that some people would be obsessed with it and trying to recreate it actually makes sense. I think it was good, but I'm glad that they didn't like kind of lean into it the way some isekai animes go, where it's like literally a role playing game. It was just more like it happens in a fantasy universe where magic have specific rules, um, which is more like a game, but also not exclusively. Like we could talk about soft magic systems versus hard magic systems at some other point. This movie had a hard-ish magic system, which was good, but also the characters still took the time to be the movie took the time to be deliberate about why this feels like a role-playing game, not just a fantasy world. And it does it when it has to, and when it doesn't, then it just kind of works as a fantasy, which is more generic, and I think maybe a better way to describe it as influenced by the fantasy genre at large.
So for people who haven't seen the movie, in the world of Onward, the older brother, played by Chris Pratt, his name is Barley. He's portrayed as this essentially like a nerdy geek. He plays this tabletop role playing game. I can't remember what it's called, but it's very similar to D&D, it seems. And they throughout the film they kind of explain that this game that they play is actually based on the history of magic, and so all the things in the game correlate to something in the real world. But it's been long enough, in the history that most people look at this game, they say, "Oh, that's just a myth. Like it's not real. Like it's something the people who made the game came up with." And as the movie goes on, you start to discover actually like a lot of the things that are part of this game are part of this actual history. And I couldn't help it but draw a comparison to Yu-Gi-Oh in that sense. Because for people who've never seen Yu-Gi-Oh, that's an anime show about people who play a trading card game. And in the universe of Yu-Gi-Oh, the trading card game is, air quotes, inspired by these ancient battles that would happen in between Egyptians in universe. So everyone's like, oh, in the world of Yu-Gi-Oh, it's like, oh yeah, this is based on these myths that happened at this other point in history. And spoiler alert, in present day, people from ancient Egypt show up and they're like, we're going to have a battle now. And it turns out we're going to use the exact same system that exists in your trading card game. Makes for very convenient storytelling there. But there's that same element that's in Onward, wherein something that is perceived to be like myth is actually history. And so it's like a situation where the fiction or the supposed fiction is actually based on reality.
It's funny you mentioned that, Average Joe, because I have heard of Yu-Gi-Oh a million times, and that like it's a trading card game and all that, but I didn't know about the extra details that you just mentioned. So bringing that up, yeah, I'm bringing it directly to Onward, and I'm like, yeah, that is kind of similar. That's actually so cool. I honestly, for some reason, I don't know why I because like I like anime and all that, but I guess I tend to lean towards more Studio Ghibli, and I've just never watched an episode of Yu-Gi-Oh. But yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering where you were going when you talked about Yu-Gi-Oh, but yeah, it is pretty similar. I like it.
Now, when we were talking about how the critics were reacting and people, like, we kind of said like, yeah, it wasn't the greatest movie, and I think part of that's because in a lot of respects the story was fairly predictable.
I mean, it's an interesting thing that this movie does. Like, there's that thin line between doing proper reincorporation into movies and being like straight up predictable. And I think this movie kind of goes back and forth between the two. There are something that like, ah, yeah, they mentioned it. Okay, it's back, and it was like good callback. And there were others where like, okay, well, there's going to be a gelatinous cube here because they've mentioned a gelatinous cube at least 4 times and made sure to go, very hard into mentioning it. Which I suppose is a Dungeons and Dragon pretty like iconic monster, but uh, I think it's one of those things. When I was thinking about this movie, I don't know if you guys have seen The Hitman's Bodyguard. Uh, it's a movie that I was like, this movie was exactly what I was expecting. It's a movie where Samuel L. Jackson is a hitman, and oh, now I forgot. Ryan Reynolds is a bodyguard trying to save him, and they have a rivalry, and they play off each other. It wasn't anything amazing. It wasn't bad either. It was exactly what I expected, and I feel like this movie was kind of had that almost that problem. It was like it was exactly what I expected it to be. It didn't go out of its way to be amazing, but it didn't suck either. But a lot of it, and I guess that feeds into the predictability, was like, yeah, this is what's happening, and I know it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because I like the movie. I thought it was quite entertaining and quite enjoyable. But it's interesting how I think with Pixar animation, um, geez, there are probably at least 5 or 6 films that they've made that have blown me away, that have emotionally resonated with me. Like they are quite the high bar of animation to try and get to, right? So I think when we come across Pixar movies that are pretty good, I feel like sometimes we might be a bit harder on them because we've seen how incredible Pixar can get, right? There are other good animation studios that are working, but for me, Pixar has just impressed me time and time again. So I think Onward is a movie that has a lot of pretty good ideas, right? I thought the movie was consistently funny. I thought it was a really fun idea to have this, like, oh, here's a world that's kind of like ours, but fantasy is real. Magic does exist. And there's definitely the emotional story about these 2 kids trying to meet their dad, which is great and all. But I don't think there was any point in the movie where it had a big idea, whether dealing with its characters or story, that made me say, yes, this is amazing. This is top tier Pixar. So it has a lot of pretty good ideas. And at the end of the day, it is a pretty good movie. But I feel like, yeah, I'm a little harder on it because these are from the same people that have made the Toy Story movies and Incredibles and Coco and Wall-E and Up. And yeah, so I think we kind of look at it a bit differently. I do at least, but I still had a good time. I still enjoyed it.
like there's a liar revealed storyline in this film, and I feel like that's such a cliche kids film, family film idea.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a cliche. It was ultimately completely unnecessary. That's my issue with it. Like, I know there are some cliches that just happen a lot, and like you don't need to necessarily stray away from it. It's just that in this particular movie, it was actually completely unnecessary. Exactly the same story beats, even almost exactly the same scene could have happened just without, and it's not really like without the conflict. The conflict was purely artificial. There was still a third act conflict even without that, and it was so like the separation between the characters was so short and even physically so small that it was almost complete. Like, I think it was completely meaningless to put it in the movie. Like, they were
Right.
what, 200 meters away from each other when that happened for about like a minute and a half. Like, what was the purpose of putting it in there?
And now we're starting to narrow into things that are going to be spoilery. So, uh, before we go into the spoiler verse, just to say, Ben, Ben the movie buff was right. We're being a little hard on this because it is a Pixar movie, but it's not a bad movie. So if you have Disney Plus or you want to rent it, I'd recommend Onward. But we're gonna go into the spoiler verse now, where we give freedom to talk about all kinds of spoilers.
Ooh.
All right.
There'll be a time code in the description. You can skip around if you want to just hear our final thoughts and avoid spoilers. So here we go. First and foremost, yeah, just to kind of like finish this thought about the whole liar revealed thing. I thought Barley's whole arc was kind of confusing to me because it's like, yeah, he's initially presented as like, slacker dork who doesn't have any purpose in his life. And then it seems like he has this time to shine a bit because he has all this knowledge of this game that is actually benefiting them in their quest. But then he gets to the point where he's like, oh, let's take this route because it's the way to go. And to me, it didn't seem like there was no reasoning. It's like, no, you just want to have fun with this. And I was really feeling the tension of the time. It's like, no, like they only have so much time. Like, why do you want to take this long? And he didn't have a good reason. He's like, oh, you just gotta trust me. And um, the liar revealed element of like his brother thinking he is a screw up, even though it just like, I'm like, yeah, in my eyes Barley is a screw up.
Yeah. But the other thing is that it was already kind of resolved. Like, they talked through it and talked about him being a screw up and how he still loves him, and like it didn't need more than that. Like, it didn't need to come back. And I like, again, if we're going into spoilers, right? He had the checklist of everything he wanted to do with his dad that day, and he ended up doing it with his brother, which helped him to realize that his brother had been there, as a father figure, and which means that he isn't a screw up. But like, he could have realized that even without going back to, oh yeah, you are a screw up. We came back where we started. It's like even if his brother had been wrong, which he clearly wasn't. Like, they followed clues that made sense, that found the way they were supposed to go, and which made the adventure better. And he's just like going back to it and being like, "Oh no, clearly we messed up," even though there were already two occasions where his brother was right that taking the side road was a better thing. So there was no point in like changing his mind about that, right? They just had to keep following it, and then no surprise, 2 minutes later, turns out his brother was right.
I don't know, to me it seemed like Barley needed to do some growing up, and I guess maybe that's where like the whole dynamic with him like never saying goodbye to his father plays into it. But I was kind of on Ian's side the whole time. I never really bought into where Barley, and maybe it's because he didn't provide any reasoning. It's like, oh, we should go this way because that's what you do on a quest. It's like, well, that's not like you. I don't know. I was really invested in the situation. It's like, if this is where we're at, like, you need to give me more than it's the what we should do, and you should just trust me implicitly.
I agree with that, like, in the moment, but once Ian had accepted it the first time, there was no reason for him to go back on it. Like there were legitimate reasons for him to think his brother's a screw up, and I still think, yeah, you're right, he kind of was, but he still was a good father figure to him. Like, he still was there for him all the time, which is ultimately what he realizes. But like, when they got out of the sewers and they were back where they started, and he's like so angry that they weren't there, it's like, yeah, but clearly your brother has already showed you two different, like there's already been two different ways that you went down this path, and it made sense that this was the path, and this was more ancient, like the magic, like what you're looking for to revive your father. So it really didn't make sense for it to come back. Is my big issue.
Yeah, so the whole his brother was there from the whole time, and like Ian kind of realizing that, oh, I had a father figure in my life and not like my dad, my like, paternal figure there. That was one of the things that was like you could tell they were building towards that. And I was like, yep, I see where this is going. And it was, admittedly that was one of the most touching elements of the story. It was like, oh yeah,
Yeah,
like Ian had this like expectation in his mind. It's like what having a father would be like, and like what he thinks he missed out on. And it was only through this whole experience that he essentially realized that like actually like he's not the one who missed out on anything. It was Barley who missed out on something.
Yeah, I like that part about the story as well. I think that's actually like a mature thing for Ian to have a realization about, because there's this I've heard this like screenwriting rule before, which really sticks with me, and I think about it when I watch movies, where they say, um, give your audience what they want, just not in the way that they expect it, right? And I feel like if the movie resulted in both of the brothers getting to meet their father and having like a couple hours with them, the mother gets to see them again. I feel like that's just, we're kind of expecting that maybe it might be that perfect, but I actually kind of like the way that it ended up in the movie. Is that there's a bit of sadness. There's maybe tragedy is a strong word for it, but when Ian gets to watch and see his father from so many feet away, and seeing that Barley gets like literally a minute to chat with him, I felt like that was actually, Barley got to say his farewell, and Ian still got to see the whole thing go down. He still got to contribute, and like he did a lot to get them to where they were. So yeah, I kind of like how a lot of that wrapped up in a way.
And that whole sequence like made me cry. Like that moment resonated with me emotionally. And my brother King Boo kind of like he's talked to us as brothers about how that movie like impacted him emotionally and how it applies to our family. And you know I was kind of walking into Onward being like, okay, like I don't know what he's talking about, but let's see. And then when this scene all came, I was like, oh, like I totally get where he's coming from. And I loved the selflessness that Ian portrayed there, where he was like, you know what, like even though I've never met the man at all, uh, it's I'm gonna like sacrifice like whatever I think I'm entitled to so that you can actually have this moment with him. I thought that was beautiful. It had me in tears. I'm like, Pixar, you've done it again.
Yeah, and can I also just say quickly, um, I think two of the ideas that I thought were really funny things in the last in the climax was, I love how the painting of the dragon that we see at the school earlier on, how that becomes the face of the dragon that is assembled of bricks and rocks and all these other pieces. And I'm sure you guys probably noticed, but do you remember the sound that was coming out of the dragon's mouth when the dragon roared?
The school bell.
Yeah, I thought
yeah,
that I just thought that was really clever. That instead of hearing the typical dragon roar, that is the school bell. I was like, that's funny. I like that.
yeah. I
Some of
think it
the
was like, again, really enjoyed what they did and how they did it in that last part of the movie. Like basically, as soon as the like 2 minutes of the movie, I don't know if it was really that long. It might have been longer. It felt meaningless. Of the lie reveal were over. Everything that happened at the end of the movie was great, but you also saw it coming a mile away, which lessened it a little bit, but not enough. Like it's still like it hit. Like I said, this movie hits the point it's supposed to hit, and it hits them well, but not in a like original or creative way. In a straightforward way, which isn't. It's not bad. Again, we're judging it based on other like Pixar movies that just wasn't as good or as creative as others have been.
some other elements of the film that I thought were very well done. The Manticore as a character. I had zero expectations for her, and then I just loved the way she was portrayed. I loved her whole kind of like the fear that had welled up in her, and like it's like, yeah, in modern day culture, like people are very concerned about being sued, and they're concerned about liability issues, and totally, if you were the person sending people out on quests, you would have that kind of um, attitude about you. And so like her journey throughout the film, I thought was hilarious. and the way the mom was portrayed, because mother characters in these kind of movies kind of get at the short end of the stick, like they're very passive and not involved in the story. But what I appreciated about like this mother, played by Julia Louise-Dreyfus of Seinfeld fame, she was very much involved in the story. It's like once she realizes what's happened, she kind of starts her own quest to like try and help the boys out. And if she and the Manticore hadn't gotten that sword, like the movie would have had a very different ending. So it was very cool to see her involved in all of this. And I was talking to One Shot earlier today, and he made a point of saying like the fact that she was portrayed as like a parent, like a widow who had kind of moved on and was in a relationship with another person. You don't see that in movies very often. Typically, especially like Pixar movies or family films, where you see families experience some kind of tragedy, and there's like actually like a healthy uh, moving on, if you will, moving onward, I guess. From that. So it was, the mom was. I was very surprised by like her role in the film as well.
Yeah, and I think also the way they handled the stepdad situation, or mom's boyfriend, was like, especially I really enjoyed the scene where the boys are like like have an illusion around them to look like him, and they're talking to the other cop, and the other cop's like, we know it's hard, you're getting into a relationship with somebody who already has kids, and they're like, it wasn't a long, but they addressed it, and they kind of, even though it was in a funny way, it was a justifiable reason for him to be acting weird and to be acting weird around those kids. And it was acknowledging that, even though the boys didn't like him that much, it's not like he was a bad person. And I think, like, and yeah, it was something more of a healthy relationship than you're used to seeing, because usually it's like either like the step parent is totally bad and we know it, but the mom doesn't know it, or like, they are trying so hard and end up being redeemed at the end, but he didn't. Like, he did kind of, but he wasn't. It wasn't like him who came in to save the day at the end. It was still their mom, which I appreciated. It was more realistic.
BPR, you talked about the magic system in the non spoilers. Is there anything to add?
I mean, I also talked about it when I did the first take for the introduction to the movie. Like, he at the end of the movie, they say that Ian rebuilt the school with magic, and it seemed to have been something he had done very quickly. And like, I understand the concept behind, like, the entire concept behind the movie is that like technology was easier to acquire than magic, and you didn't have to work hard and people got lazy, and it's a good analogy for technology. We didn't really touch on that, but it's there. But at the same time, the power that a single individual can harness through magic is still so significant that it's un- almost unthinkable watching that movie that everybody had dropped it. And it's the same thing, the same problem I kind of had with like the way Barley talked to the Pixies and they started using their wings even though they didn't, and they immediately started flying. Is that really you would give up flying, like a very basic thing that you are capable of doing because of innate magic, because it's easier to take a motorcycle, but it really isn't. And I found that there was kind of inconsistency there. But beyond that, like, I did appreciate that there was a specific like way that magic has to be cast. A, because it's a good callback to like role playing games, but also because it was a good way for Barley to be able to kind of, even though he didn't have any magical power and Ian did, he was still the person coaching Ian on magic because he knew about it. I mean, it taps into one of my least favorite tropes about magic systems, where it's like head knowledge versus gift, but we're not going to get into that. But I did think that it was kind of odd that there was no magic, like, and that apparently this happened over like one generation, because the Manticore used to be an adventurer. Granted, we don't know how old she is. It could have been centuries, but I feel like that was maybe one of the biggest weakness in the world building, was that it was kind of inconsistent in that way. And uh, another thing I forgot to mention, we were talking about D&D, but partially because I saw that we're going to talk about the mom later. There was this strong vibe for me that the mom used to be an adventurer when she was younger. Because you get that in role playing games sometimes. You like meet this person, it's like he used to be a great, adventurer, if you're going to use the classic example. Then he took an arrow to the knee, or in her case, raised a family alone and had to give up part of it. And I thought that was kind of cool, the idea that maybe, she was an adventuring party with their dad, and but then she didn't know about their dad, practicing magic, so that was also kind of weird. And like I said, the timeline was inconsistent as to when technology started to take over. I think that had those aspects been a little more polished and maybe go into kind of what the previous history of the parents was, even if it's just through pictures or through a short flashback or something, like pictures around the house that she lingers looking at, um, it would have done a good service to the movie. But as it is, the magic system is only there for plot convenience, and that was kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, see, I got the sense it had been a very long time since people were running around doing magic, and the Manticore just happened to be very, very old. But that's an interesting take. Like I hadn't thought of that before. So if you think the mom used to do adventuring, let us know. I think the final thing to talk about, there's this Pixar theory that suggests that every Pixar movie is set in the same universe. But I think Onward really kind of messes with that because like they show us a history of how like they're used to like it's not like most Pixar films are kind of just set in one period in time, so you can kind of like place it in the timeline of Earth's history to say like, oh, this is when that movie, this is when that movie happens. But I feel like Onward kind of breaks that a bit because it shows you like the way it used to be. Like it shows you this point in history there was all these mythical creatures and magic, and then it shows you present day where there's still mythical creatures and there's still magic, and I feel like that doesn't follow in line with most Pixar
Ah,
movies.
I mean, I'll say yes and no, and I don't know. Ben probably knows more about that than I do, but I've like the idea of the Pixar theory is that it does contain Monsters Inc., which is like the mutations of people into monsters that eventually happens, and that society had the time to evolve to the point where they had very similar technology than we have nowadays. So if you're stretching a timeline out that much, you could have, and it's the same thing with like cars, where the cars have a technology comparable to humans, and like there's like the timeline in the Pixar theory is large enough that it could have been, either after Monsters Inc. There was another catastrophe in the world or something went wrong, and then people were reborn into magic. If for those who know, it's similar to the lore of Adventure Time, and then that society again evolved until technology was a thing. Like it's, I don't think it screws it up. It definitely, though, doesn't slot into it as well as the rest of most of the rest of the movies.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up because yeah, it's been a few years since I sat down and watched the Pixar Theory video. But yeah, I would say that Onward possibly challenges it. It possibly challenges like how could it fit into the Pixar Theory. Off the top of my head, I don't have any big groundbreaking ideas about how it would fit. But I think beef pork ribs is right that there could be, if you can have a Pixar theory that involves movies like Monsters Inc. and also involves movies like Brave, that I think it's possible for it to fit in there somewhere. I'd be interested to see if someone does like an updated Pixar theory in the next few months where they say, here's how Onward fits into it, because I'm sure there's a way. I mean, the only thing I can think of is that either, whether it be due to just like a vast time difference where big changes happen and maybe magic was always around, that Onward kind of takes place, or unless someone would expand the scope. Because if I remember correctly, I think the whole point, not the whole point, but the Pixar theory, all the films take place on Earth. Correct me if I'm wrong. So maybe someone could say, oh, Onward maybe takes place in the same galaxy, just on a different planet. Kind of a similar idea where like the Marvel Cinematic Universe has different, it has Earth, but it has other realms where like, oh, Thor has a bit more to do with magic, but then there's other planets and universes where Guardians of the Galaxy takes place. So maybe it could fit in that way. But it is funny remembering the Pixar theory and figuring out where exactly does Onward fall. And I think it'd be cool if someone were able to answer that in a understanding way.
I
For
think,
all we know, someone's already done that. But
I mean, real quick to wrap that up, like as a dungeon master, one of the things that you can do in Dungeons and Dragons, a role playing game, is saying you've got two things that are completely different, and you want them to happen more or less simultaneously. You say, well, travel was really hard, and this happened on a different continent that people didn't go to. And in the Pixar theory, we already have the idea that the world, like Monsters Inc., happens very far in the future where things have evolved to basically be monsters. Well, there are no humans, only humanoids in Onwards. It could also be happening at the same time as Monsters Inc. in a different part of the world.
see, my hot take that I'm gonna throw the hot take out there that Monsters Inc., like Monstropolis, wherever they live, is actually like a separate dimension, and they use those doors to travel to the main Earth. So perhaps that means that Onward is actually just another. It's a multiverse situation where Onward is like one dimension, Monstropolis is one dimension, and then the main universe is where everything else happens.
I'd have to review it, but I think that the doors are magic and involve time traveling because the witch in Brave is the little girl from Monsters Inc. That's part of a Pixar theory, but this, yeah, it is but it would make it easier to. But the problem with is as soon as you do multiverse theory, you can literally slot anything into something. You know, the Rick and Morty syndrome. So it's cooler if it wasn't that.
I really liked one of the moments I laughed the hardest at. I think just the idea of having the dad's legs and only the dad's legs walking around was kind of fun. I like how when the dad's legs are dancing around, and Ian's like, I wonder how he would have danced, and Barley kind of pretends to be the top half of the dad. I think visually that was a funny joke. And I also like how when the sprites are chasing the brothers, that at one point the dad's upper half, which of course Ian made with like stuffing and all that, leans out the window, and because it's fast and windy, the upper half, like it's just flailing around, but it but it looks like the upper half is kind of shaking its fist angrily at the pixies, and of course that enrages the pixies to want to get them and chase them down even more. So I thought those were two of the funniest moments, and they're just very clever moments. That like this reminds me of Pixar. That like Pixar has a lot of really funny ideas and ways of doing jokes, and those were two of the things that made me laugh the hardest.
I'll add to that, because we have ragged on it quite a little bit. There are still some really good things. Everything to do with Guinevere was good.
Yeah, that's right. Guinevere was awesome.
So coming around to final thoughts, for myself, I did enjoy Onward. It hit me emotionally at the end. Being a guy who has two brothers, it certainly meant a lot in that respect. And there is sort of the wish fulfillment element where someone with a lot of nerdy or geeky knowledge becomes very important to the story. Of course, there's like an element of that where I'm like, yeah, if only that were me. If all this information I had became really useful in real life, like there's a wish fulfillment there that I, of course, couldn't help but connect to. So yeah, that's my hot take. Final thoughts. What about you guys?
I think just a last reminder, just because we're being really critical of some of the aspects of this movie is really just because it's Pixar and they usually do things that are mind blowing. It is still a very good movie.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that as well. I'd say that sometimes, yeah, when you're hard on something, it's because you have a previous example to kind of, in a way, compare it to. And yeah, Onward was still an enjoyable movie. I still had fun with it. I still liked a lot of the ideas it had. And while not as great as some of others Pixar movies, I think without a doubt it's still something that's enjoyable enough that I think most people could watch and get a kick out of, especially the fantasy elements, especially the D&D quests that they have to embark on. So I still had a good time, and I always look forward to whatever Pixar is working on.
So I will give Onward 2.9 out of 4 bat cookies.
I think I'm going to
Uh,
be a little bit nicer and actually give it a 3 out of 4 bat cookies. If we're doing out of 4, can we do arbitrary systems? I'll give it
The
a.
bat jar system is out of 4 bat cookies. We
All
can
right,
give
so I'll
decimals.
give it a 3 out of 4.
yeah, I agree with beef pork ribs. I'd also give it a 3 out of 4 bat cookies as well.
So there you go. Onward is now available on Disney Plus if you have that service. And you can, of course, rent it or buy it digitally. So if you've enjoyed our conversation, if you think you'd enjoy this movie, feel free to go check it out. We would normally go into the bat jar and look at our mail, but we do not have any this week. So all of you who are at home listening to the podcast, you can certainly take time to email us because we have the time to answer them.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
message us on Facebook or message us on Twitter at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast in whatever platform you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Please give us a rating, write reviews for our shows, and share our posts on social media. This will help us to bring all people inside the Bat Jar.
So normally we would go into the bat jar and pull out a topic for next week, but Beef Pork Ribs, the very first episode of the year we did was going through a list of all the films that were going to be coming out this year, and COVID-19 has basically made that entire episode obsolete. And I think it's high time for us to kind of like essentially look at the release schedule again and actually, to have a conversation about how COVID-19 has actually impacted nerd and geek culture, because the short version is, of course, a lot of things have been delayed, some things have been canceled, but I think it's going to be prudent for us, and people who listen might be interested in finding out just what are all the different things that have been impacted by the pandemic. So not trying to be clickbaity or topical or whatever, but for the sake of at least updating our own records, it should be an interesting conversation to have next week to talk about all the things that have been delayed and what will actually end up happening this year versus happening in future years. So, Ben the Movie Buff, we want to thank you for being a part of the show today. It's, of course, always great to have you. And you and everyone else who's been part of the show is welcome to be here as long as we have to all be quarantined. So, thank you very much for being here today.
No worries. I always have a blast doing this. I mean, I feel like I literally say those words every time I come on the show. But yeah, it's so much fun. It was great to chat with you guys about Onward today. And yeah, I will keep on coming back as long as you guys have me. So I look forward to our discussion next week. But and if you guys are looking for other stuff to do during this time, feel free to follow me on YouTube. My channel is called Ben the Movie Buff if you're interested in movie discussions. And yeah, feel free to check that out if you happen to have some free time.
So come back to the Bad Char podcast next week when we talk about everything that's been delayed because of COVID-19. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
I'm Ben the Movie Buff.
Catch you on the flip side.
The Swan Princess is on Netflix.
See you in the next one.